Hello, this is the introduction to definitions for disciple-making metrics. I'll go ahead and just dive into the text. So it says here, we measure what we value. We do not measure what we do not value. Measuring and recording weekly donations and attendance statistics says that we value bodies and bucks. Many churches choose to measure the big four: bodies, bucks, baptisms, and buildings. Easy to measure, these big four are often surface level measurements. They describe what the American culture tends to value. How many came? How much did they give? And do we have any new buildings? While helpful, these big four tell us very little about our main mission as a church: disciple making. At least that should be our main mission as a church. These metrics can even communicate values that are contrary to what should be most important to us: the making of disciple makers. Unfortunately, attendance numbers can be increasing, the budget growing, baptisms taking place, and new buildings added without genuine growth happening or the true development of reproducing disciple makers. We must measure the right values. A parable of sorts. Imagine a businessman or a business person who raised funds to build a shoe factory. After a year of raising funds, he hires 100 employees, builds a factory, and everyone starts working hard. At the end of the first year, the shareholders come to him and ask him how many shoes he has made. He answers, "Well, we really don't know, but everyone is working hard and we are very busy." "What?" the shareholders exclaim. "Aren't you keeping track of how many shoes you've made?" "Well, sort of," the foolish entrepreneur responds. "But since everyone has their own definition of a shoe, it has been hard to accurately measure." "Don't you have a prototype of what you're trying to produce?" "No, not really. Everyone is doing what seems best in their own eyes, and we just assumed that a shoe would one day surface. But don't worry, everyone is working very hard and keeping very busy." As a shareholder, would you continue to support this shoe factory? Of course not. Introduction. Why should it be any different in the ministry of the church? Our mission is clear: make disciples who can make disciples. Matthew 28, verse 19. This begs the question: how are we measuring how we are doing at this mission? Are we making the same mistakes as the foolish business person by measuring the wrong things, or by not measuring at all? Are we assuming that because every kingdom worker is busy, we are accomplishing our mission? Are our metrics helping us measure our progress or lack of it? Measuring only the traditional big four, while helpful, does not help us determine if we are developing, reproducing disciple makers. People in our churches are all at different stages of the disciple making process, and our metrics need to measure if we are moving people through that process. For Christ followers who are committed to making disciple makers, it is critical we get this right. Failure to measure properly the right things can undercut everything else we try to do. Our metrics must reinforce, not hinder, our true mission. Wrong metrics can undercut our disciple-making message. Before we jump into how to measure our progress as disciple makers, let me first begin with some major clarifying definitions of disciple-making metrics. The definition of a disciple. We must first define what a disciple looks like. Remember the analogy of the shoe? I especially like the simple, transferable definition of a disciple from Matthew chapter 4, verse 19, communicated by Jim Putman and discipleship.org. A disciple is someone following Christ. It's in quotations, follow me. Being changed by Christ, and I will make you and committed to the mission of Christ, fishers of men. This definition is relational. Follow me, intentional, I will make you, and missional, into fishers of men. While there are many good definitions of a disciple, this definition is biblically centered and easy to remember. It clearly captures the essence of the mandate in Matthew chapter 4 verse 19 and Mark chapter 1 verse 17, when Jesus told the disciples to follow me and I will make you fishers of men. The definition of the disciple making process. The Greek word for disciple, mathetes, is defined as a learner engaging in an apprentice relationship with a teacher. Again, the Greek word for disciple is defined as a learner engaging in an apprentice relationship with a teacher. This involves a clear process of becoming more like the teacher, or in the Christian context, Jesus. In my book 4, Chair Discipling by Moody Press, I lay out the 4 challenges of Jesus as seen in a chronological study of Jesus' life. I define 4 clear steps in the process of becoming a disciple as measured by my metaphor of 4 chairs. These 4 chairs clearly communicate the 4 challenges of Jesus given chronologically as he engages his initial disciples and develops them into fully trained disciples. Luke chapter 6 verse 40. Okay, so disciple making metrics. Number 1, come and see. John chapter 1 verse 39 is the challenge given to seekers. It is the challenge to come and investigate the faith. This is chair 1. A metaphor used to correspond with Jesus' first challenge. Number 2, follow me. John chapter 1 verse 43 is a challenge given to new believers. It is a challenge to walk alongside and learn from him. This is chair 2, a metaphor which corresponds to Jesus' second challenge. Number 3, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Matthew chapter 4 verse 19 is the challenge given to workers. This challenge moves into equipping disciples to mirror the lifestyle of Jesus. This is represented by chair 3, corresponding to Jesus' third challenge. Number 4, go and bear fruit. John chapter 15 verse 16 is a challenge given to fully trained disciple makers to go out and repeat the process with others. This is chair 4, the 4th challenge of Jesus. Here's a let me see here. Here's a diagram of what somebody put on here. Okay, so I guess it says here chair 1 is come and see. John 1:39 description to the dying and the lost. Biblical name, seeker. So this is the seeker. Biblical concept is to win souls. Basic needs, gospel answers, Christian friends. Skills needed. It doesn't say there is any for that. Lasting fruit, no fruit. Other needs, CPR. Further description, confused, unbelieving. And see how it goes, and then it goes to the next one is chair 2. Follow me. Description, child. Biblical name, believer. Biblical concept, to build. These are just the different descriptions of what going from one chair to the next chair, and eventually you'll be in the fourth chair, or you're going to be go and bear fruit, disciple making, multiplying. But I'm gonna for the sake of this video, I'm gonna just keep reading. It's an introduction. It says this disciple making process begins with seekers, involves new believers, demands the equipping of the few workers, and ultimately ends in sending out proven disciple makers back into the harvest field. True biblical disciple making is the whole process of winning the lost. Chair 1, growing the believer. Chair 2, equipping the worker. Chair 3, and sending out the proven multiplier. Chair 4. Biblical disciple making begins and ends in the harvest field. This disciple making process is our calling. We begin with people where they are and move them to the next step in the disciple making pathway. Historically, the term discipleship tends to be just the growing of believers, whereas disciple making involves the whole of process of all four challenges. Disciple making is our mandate, as Jesus told us to go and make disciples in Matthew chapter 28. The definition of a disciple maker. A disciple maker is simply a person who enters into relationship with people to help them follow Christ, be changed by Christ, and enter into the mission of Christ. Chapter 4, verse 19. Ideally, disciple making begins with lost seekers and ends up sending the fully trained disciples back into the harvest field to help more lost seekers move toward Christ. Disciple making begins with people where they are and then moves them to the next step in the disciple making process. Anyone who intentionally uses their life to impart Jesus' character and priorities to others, moving them through the disciple making process, is a disciple maker. All Christians are called to this task. We need to continually be asking how we can be more effective in walking, living, and discipling like Jesus. Using proper terminology, we as Great Commission disciple makers follow the command of Christ in Matthew 28 verse 19. Must get our terminology correct. Our mission is clearly making disciples, not just to do discipleship. Jesus did not say go and do discipleship. He said go and make disciples. Discipleship historically is what you do with believers. Disciple making involves the whole process of winning the lost, growing the believers, equipping the workers, and sending them out proven multipliers to repeat the process. When we don't define discipleship, well, maybe we ought not to use the term. It wasn't until 1850, anyway, that the word first surfaced when Charles Adams separated the command to make disciples into two parts, evangelism and discipleship. Unfortunately, today, when you mention disciple making, 90% of people think of discipleship, which to them means deeper Bible studies, growth level, curriculum, or more programs. Terminology matters. Growing and grounding new believers is important, but it is only one part of the disciple making process. Clearly defining the end product. Stephen Covey is in his book 7 Habits of Highly Successful People says we need to begin with the end in mind. The end product of the whole disciple making journey is not just reproduction, but also and ultimately multiplication. Disciples who make disciples, spiritual grandchildren. While training several hundred staff of a large megachurch, I noticed one day the impact made by a statement I made in passing. The statement was simply this: you haven't truly made a disciple until they in turn make a disciple. This simple statement clearly communicated that disciple making is about reproduction. And if reproduction doesn't happen, we haven't completely made a disciple. Only if this process of making disciples is replicated over and over again to several generations do you end up with a movement of multiplying disciple makers. While multiplication is the ultimate end product of true disciple making, in this short book I seek to define the metrics we need to measure the most critical end product of each step of the disciple making journey. We will begin by discussing metrics in the context of the local church and then conclude with some simple metrics for the individual disciple maker. Disciple making is both individual and corporate, meaning church-wide or ministry-wide. Disciples are made as individuals who impart their lives to others. However, the church must support the individual disciple-making pathway. Churches must design events that help move people through the four-step disciple-making pathway in cooperation with individual disciple makers' efforts. Our ultimate goal will be to see and measure clear progress in the reproduction of proven disciple makers being sent out. Metrics help us measure our progress in this four-step pathway. Jesus as our model. I write this book from a deep conviction that Jesus is our model for disciple making. While many people focus on the message of Jesus when discussing discipling, I have found great insight by going deeper and looking at the very model of Jesus' life and ministry. I believe there are at least two important ways to exegete, that is, and now analyze and study the life of Christ, using a chronological approach by studying what Jesus did the first year, second year, third year, and his fourth year. We can reconstruct Jesus' model of disciple making. The first way to exegete Jesus' life is to study how he made disciples. The second way is to look at how Jesus, as a leader, built a movement of multiplying disciples. How Jesus made disciples. So how Jesus made disciples differs from how Jesus, as a leader, built a movement. Ultimately, I believe that both approaches to understand Jesus' life and ministry are helpful. The study of how Jesus built a movement is more complex. Therefore, in this book, we will focus primarily upon how Jesus made disciples and the metrics needed in that study. But to begin with, it is my deepest conviction that Jesus was all about multiplication. His mission was not to reach the world as much as it was to make disciples capable of reaching the world. His laser focus was on multiplication. We can see this on several levels, but let me give you two examples. First, in John 15, we see Jesus giving his disciples some last words before he goes into Gethsemane. He speaks about no fruit in verse 2. Fruit, verses 2 and 4, more fruit, verse 2, and much fruit, verses 5 and 8. Fruit in the Bible is always a picture of multiplication. Genesis chapter 1:28 says, God blessed them. Be fruitful and multiply. Any farmer who knows that fruit is always a picture of multiplication. In John 15:8, Jesus clearly says, by this is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. God's agenda is for every believer to believe, God's agenda is for every believer to be in the much fruit category of living. Jesus points this out to his disciples as he gives them some final teaching in John 15. Second, on the earlier occasion, we find the only time Jesus is recorded to be full of joy by the Holy Spirit in Luke chapter 10, verse 21. The context of this is critical to understand the heart and passion of Jesus. While the Bible 3 times records that Jesus wept, Luke 11:41, John 11:35, and Hebrews 5:7, only once does it record Jesus full of joy by the Holy Spirit. The context of that passage in Luke 10 tells us so much about Jesus' ministry passion. In Luke 9, Jesus sends out the 12 apostles 2 by 2, and they come back full of joy. Jesus then takes them on a retreat. But in Luke 10, Jesus sends out the 72, the next generation of disciples, lay people, 2 by 2. And when they come back full of joy, Jesus is full of joy by the Holy Spirit. Why? Because for 3.5 years, Jesus' passion was not to reach the world, but to train his disciples to reach the world. Again, because of 3.5 years, Jesus' passion was not to reach the world, but to train his disciples to reach the world. After 3.5 years, they were now getting to the place where they could reproduce disciples. And Jesus knew his strategy would work for the 2 billion believers who live 2,000 years later. Why? He knew that without trained disciples, a movement is just a generation away from dying. Jesus' movement was laser focused upon multiplication. A fully trained disciple will not only reproduce, but also eventually multiply. This was the goal of Jesus' focus and passion. In Acts chapter 8, verse 4, you see this fully happening. As persecution hit the New Testament church, the apostles stayed in Jerusalem, but the lay people were scattered. And everywhere they went, they preached the gospel. These lay people were eventually responsible for starting the Antioch church, the model New Testament church started by lay people making disciples. The genius of Jesus was how he took uneducated and common men and masterfully developed them into reproducing disciple makers. We need to continually study his life to see how he developed his disciples. The 4 challenges of Jesus given chronologically: come and see, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men, and go and bear fruit, introduce us to the 4-step process that Jesus used to move people toward that desired end product. He relationally knew what his disciples needed in the process of becoming fully trained. Luke chapter 6, verse 40. Then Jesus masterfully and intentionally helped them take that next step. Disciple making metrics for your church or ministry. With all of this in mind, I now want to suggest 4 major metrics disciple making churches should use to keep track of their disciple making process. Each metric will help measure the progress in the disciple making pathway that Jesus modeled in his 4 challenges written about in detail in my book, 4-Chair Discipling. If you help lead a ministry that is just beginning to collect metrics, I encourage you to begin by focusing on just these 4 major metrics. Keep the process simple as you begin to measure your effectiveness at making disciples. Later, as you master the 4 major disciple-making metrics, you can begin to add the additional metrics that are suggested below on the worksheet. So I'm going to end the video now, and then the next video is going to be major metric 1 is conversion. So until next time, God bless you guys.